lumière du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
From the beginning of this coronavirus crisis, the obvious parallels to the climate crisis have just been impossible to ignore. I keep thinking about them, particularly as the pandemic plays out like an intensely sped up acute version of the climate crisis. The same warnings, the same disinformation and know-nothingness, the same tragic consequences, the same failure to act. Two aspects in particular have been haunting me. One is the invisibility of the problem, in a very literal sense. The president has even taken to calling the virus the invisible enemy, which is a hacky bit of propaganda, but based on a kernel of truth. We can't see the coronavirus, like we can't see the carbon in the air. And it's hard to mobilize people around things you can't see. In the case of both the coronavirus and carbon pollution, the absence of spectacle is an obstacle to rallying people. Second thing that's so maddening is that both the climate crisis and a global pandemic did not come out of nowhere. They're not unlikely things that might happen in the future we should plan for. No. According to experts, they're certainties. Here's Bill Gates back in 2015.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. But we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
Like Bill Gates, everyone who knows anything about global health and virology and transmission has been screaming for years about exactly this moment we're in, that it's not if, it's when. And that is also exactly what climate experts have been saying. And they've been called into question, and they've been ignored, and they've been bullied, but they're saying the exact same thing as health experts did about a pandemic. It's coming. And yet here we are standing on the tracks, watching the train barrel towards us and refusing to get out of the way. So I want to talk to a writer who's written about both of these issues, David Wallace Wells, deputy editor and climate columnist for New York Magazine. His latest book was about the climate crisis. Now he's covering the coronavirus pandemic basically full time, and he joins me now. And David, I wonder how much you've been thinking about these parallels.
They're totally hard to avoid, as you point out, and they're a lot more than the ones you just named, although those are maybe the most obvious ones. You know, the truth is the lessons of the coronavirus and the climate crisis are quite similar, too, in the sense that they remind us that we don't live outside of nature, no matter where we are, no matter who we are, no matter what country we live in or how rich we are. We still live subject to the laws of nature and occasionally subject to its brutality. And they also teach us that all of these crises of this scale, are much better when we get a handle on them really early. Studies out of China show that if they had acted 3 weeks earlier, they could have avoided 95% of all of the spread of coronavirus through the country, possibly preventing its spread throughout the world. And a new bit of research this week shows that in New York, if we had taken action 2 weeks earlier, we could have prevented 90% of all deaths. They also the coronavirus opens up a whole new spectrum of political possibility that a lot of climate activists are, I think, quite excited about for some good reasons and for some complicated reasons. But the truth is, when you look out at the planet right now, it's hard not to be moved by the expression of global solidarity and fellow feeling that is demonstrated by a literally hemisphere-wide quarantine that is being engaged in willingly by billions of people in part out of concern for their own health, but also out of concern for the health of those around them. And considering that's really the ultimate project and challenge facing us with climate change, how can we make everybody care more about our collective fate? You can look at this incredible tragedy and horror with some hope. The question is whether we can sustain that kind of feeling through a year or more of quite exhausting struggle, expensive public spending, and all of the pain and suffering that we're going to be witnessing, and come out on the other side still with some political capital and some literal capital to make the kind of investments in green infrastructure and power that we need to.
Well, that point about international solidarity, I think, is a really important one, because it's something about the climate movement I always find very inspiring and moving. You know, on days of these sort of international global climate actions, you'll see, like, here's school children in Nigeria, and here are activists in Pakistan, and here are folks in Seoul, South Korea, and here are people in Moscow, and here are people in New York City. And it's like, right, we all got the same climate. we all got the same thing we got to deal with. And you're seeing that in this pandemic, the same sort of moving feeling when you see healthcare workers, you see nurses, or you see people banging on pots and pans in all these countries around the world, very distant places, very different people in very different situations. And again, the thing we have to beat is the same thing, and we all have to work together to beat it. And in that way, this period also feels a bit like a test, right? Like the level of global coordination in a short, acute period where there is some political capital because it's so pressing, as a kind of dry run for what we need to do at a bigger scale afterwards.
And we've accomplished, honestly, so much. I mean, we're in many countries of the world, I would say even most countries of the world, we've failed to take seriously the coronavirus crisis at the speed that we needed to. And yet, just in the space of just a few months, we've engineered as you say, a kind of coordinated, although not literally coordinated, global response in which all of the nations of the Northern Hemisphere and many in the global South have basically upended all forms of life, all economic activity, all social activity in their countries for the sake of self-protection. It's amazing all of the things that we used to take for granted as permanent, unmovable features of modern life, the way that the economy worked, the limited ways that our government could help and move quickly to protect us. All of these things that we took for granted as unchangeable have been proven to be quite changeable in just the time span of a few months, when we recognize just how big the crisis that we're facing really is. We haven't yet gotten there with climate change, in part because it's still, despite those inspiring marches, just a small group of people who really believe that this crisis is as urgent as the scientists tell us it is. And we need many more people to feel that way. With COVID, almost everyone is as scared as they possibly could be. And as a result, we're seeing, in certain ways, top-down, but in other ways, voluntary efforts to basically change how we live on the planet, on a dime, and in quite dramatic ways, which, honestly, I find kind of breathtaking.
That's a really great point, right? The suspension of normalcy and the speed with which it's happened, and the sort of horizon of possibility, which is both sort of devastating and brutal because people are losing their jobs and people are going to food banks and people are sick and all that. But also the idea that you can coordinate a remarkable amount. I mean, half the world's population almost on a dime, in a sense, right? In a few weeks, you have half the world's population suddenly abruptly ending every single daily ritual and daily life as normalcy, and also the political possibilities. I mean, we should note, like, there's the sort of, you have the way that CO2 goes up, the way that coronavirus spreads through a population, like those two graphs which we have, like, both look unnervingly similar and both sort of create this kind of urgency to act quickly. But there's also the fact that, like, the kind of political frontier of the possible, how are we going to pay for it? This question that haunted the questions of the Green New Deal. Now it's like $2.2 trillion out the door in a few weeks.
Yeah, a few months ago, if you would ask the average American, would the country be willing to go into a total economic shutdown, reduce its economic output by as much as 30%, impose 30% unemployment on itself in order to save 1% to 2% of the population? Most Americans would have told you that was impossible. It would have been an indictment of the country that it wasn't, that they did think it was impossible, but they would have told you that it was really hard to imagine. And now here we are, just in the space of a few months, and we've done exactly that. And not only that, we've seen, Republican senators proposing something like UBI. We've seen talk about the government claiming some ownership stake in airlines in exchange for bailouts. These are things that used to be so far outside the Overton window of political possibility that nobody ever talked about it as even imaginable. And now they're very much at the center of our political conversation. We need to take that expanded horizon and apply it to climate change, because we need many more things to happen that are enclosed within our existing sense of what's possible. We need to expand that horizon on climate as aggressively as we have with COVID-19.
It is Tuesday, the 21st of April of 2020, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam, and our daily special is Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. Oh my, just as you know, a small scant dash, a mere pinch of smoked hot Hungarian paprika will make all the difference in the world. In fact, whole civilizations flourished and then floundered in pursuit of the great spice. It had to have had some sort of importance. Hey, speaking of importance, did you hear that the oil market totally tanked? And that's no pun. It totally tanked. In fact, an empty tank would have cost you more than a whole filled up barrel, 42 gallons, by the way, of oil. So, those 50-gallon drums actually will cost a lot more. The empty 50-gallon drum will cost a lot more than a full 42-gallon barrel of oil. And that's a first. That's never happened before in the history of the spot market on oil. And I got to tell you, even for tulips. I mean, tulips never traded negative. So that's something that made America first. And who's supposedly the leader of America first? Yep, that guy. And he thinks it's good. Oh, well, maybe we ought to start buying up all the oil. Maybe we should start renting storage space. Buddy, when oil tanks in such a precipitous drop, and it's never had such a precipitous drop before. Let's just say that when oil went to $15 to $12 a gallon, you know what else happened? Yeah, they called it a Great Recession. And in fact, the oil spot market, such as it was before the Great Depression, totally tanked several months before the crash. So analysts look at the oil market as the canary in the coal mine. Wow, that's mixing metaphors and industries. Fossilized dead industries, by the way. I don't know if the whale oil industry was used in a similar fashion as fossil fuels, but I do know that the whale oil industry sure held on with tetherhooks. You know, they did have tetherhooks in the whaling industry, literally. So they held on and they wanted a lot of government help to keep their industry alive. But when there's only so many whales in the ocean, you know what else happens? Well, now it looks like Trump is the ventilator king. Yeah, the ventilator king. How'd that happen? And the whole thing about ventilators was just a political ploy by the Democrats to make him look bad. What kind of mobster is so idiotic that mobsters, real true life mobsters have more humanity than this guy. And I gotta say, as dim-witted as a lot of these mobsters are, they seem to have a lot more on the ball up there in the old noggin, too. This guy really thinks that this is all a political ploy. Now it's testing. The reason he doesn't want to test is because it's just the Democrats trying to make him look bad. Because actually, it's the world, it's nature, it's the way of it's just the way of things, Donnie. When you test, the numbers will show what they show. And he knows it won't be good for him politically, because it will remind people of what an inept leader he is, which beggars the point. when he goes up in front of America every single day, even on the weekends, because he can't have his rallies. He can't even remember when he had he doesn't remember his rallies in March. I had rallies. No, I've been here for months and months and months. It's only April. Idiot. But so these press conferences or campaign rallies in front of the press in the press room substitute for his hate fests. And so in which he can aggrandize himself, self-aggrandize. And, everybody loves me. Yeah, when Yamiche Alcindor asked him, hey, a lot of people have died when you said no one was going to. Do you think that maybe, they have a point? And you know what Trump's response was? Well, you don't need to know. Of course you do. And you can probably just figure it out without even, hearing or reading about the press conference yesterday. But his response was, everybody loves me. I'm here, aren't I? I got elected. Wait a second. She was asking you about, don't you feel bad about people dying? And his response was, apparently a lot of people love me. They elected me. Like those very fine people out there with their guns, protesting a pandemic and yelling at nurses. Go to China, you commie. What? And then you got Dan Patrick in the same vein saying, hey, there's a lot more important things than living. And then when you call them a death cult, oh, no, we're not a death, we're Christians. Well, I don't know. A lot of people think that's the same thing. I mean, look at what you worship, a guy tortured and murdered on a cross. And the idea that, maybe, that's happening to me. I'm being crucified because they're making me stay at home so people can be healthy. Jeez. Okay. It does also confuse me a little bit because the very same people who whine and whine and whine about fluoride in the water and chemtrails in the sky and 5G in your brain cannot wrap their brains around the fact that people are dying from COVID-19. They don't believe it. They'll believe, fluoride in the water is a conspiracy, and chemtrails in the sky are a conspiracy. Well, they do think that the pandemic is a conspiracy, but one not existent, where the others are. Oh, yeah, I'm going to get some sort of cosmic rays from 5G. Well, you're not going to get the cosmic rays from 5G. You get the cosmic rays because they're ubiquitous to the universe, or the multiverse, as far as we know. Well, what else happened in the world? All sorts of stuff. We had a suspected tornado. Wait. I read this article in the Associated Press, and they called a tornado touching down and killing people suspected, like it's a murder suspect. A tornado doesn't have constitutional guarantees of innocent before proven guilty. What is up? I kind of have a feeling that maybe the editor has been sheltering in place, and the kids have run of the roost. It's a little scary. Because it's not a suspected tornado. It's a tornado or it isn't. And usually when it isn't, usually it doesn't kill people. When it isn't a tornado. Dust devils do not kill people. Tornadoes do. So let's be clear. Suspected tornado. What's it going to do? Go in front of a judge? A jury of its peers? Oh, my God. Well, that's where we are now. I mean, we got idiots out there with guns protesting against a pandemic. Yeah, that's going to work. Oh, I heard Cotton Mather was invoked as, getting Christians in line back in the day. Well, let's be clear about Cotton Mather. All right? He was really kind of a racist. Kind of. That's putting it mildly. He was a racist. And so you got to look at it through that lens. Please, Cotton Mather, the great hero of America. Certainly frightening. Read your history books, kids. Hey, what's on the rest of the menu here today in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy? At the top, hey, the obvious parallels to the climate crisis have been impossible to ignore. As we heard on Inners last night and at the top, the same warnings, the same disinformation, the same tragic consequences, the same failure to act, and I might add, the same astroturfing. It's certainly amazing, isn't it? Almost like it's a vast right-wing conspiracy of death cultists. On the rest of the menu, the Supreme Court added a computer fraud case to its merits docket for next term. We'll look into that when that starts happening. The Supreme Court sided with British Petroleum Atlantic Richfield to curtail Superfund site cleanup lawsuits. Yeah, try to say that real fast. Yeah, did you know that Atlantic Richfield got gobbled up by British Petroleum? Yeah, they call it a unit of British Petroleum, but I thought it was important to tell you what that unit really is. And in a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court ended Oregon's practice of allowing split verdicts to convict felony defendants. Well, it's about time. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where the World Health Organization said it is currently not possible to determine the precise source of the new coronavirus, though they think it is born from an animal, maybe a bat. People don't eat bats. But those animals that do eat bats, see how that works? And UNICEF reported that the new coronavirus will impoverish millions of children in the Middle East alone. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. At netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is our chat room link, monitored by Kelly Lincoln, who does so much more, as I've been saying all this time, and thank you, Kelly. To the leftish of the page from the chat room link at the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com is our Patreon link, and as you heard before, if you listen to the show, and you're going to hear for the first time if you haven't, if you could become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio, that recurring contribution, say how about the cost of an espresso-type coffee drink? If you could afford to send us that once a month, we are able to stretch those dollars on the quantum level beyond compare, which is, I know, impossible, but things only exist on the quantum level if you can measure them, and if they're beyond compare, do they really exist? But nonetheless, we have been able to do that. And it's also a part of string theory, too. This will all make sense in time, I'm sure. And we've been doing this stretching on the subatomic level for over 9 years now, going on 10 of continuous 24/7, 365 resistance broadcasting only because of your help. And we thank you for your generosity, and I should give a big shout out once again. Thank you to those of you out there who have upped your monthly contribution. It warms the heart. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, do so at Netroots Radio. Tom takes care of that, and thank you, Tom. I take care of at Justice Putnam, and I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Kos about 10 minutes before showtime, and then link that up on social media, including Facebook now. And I'm still not kicked out. I'm still waiting. Something will happen, I know. But regardless, you can get the most important part of the show are the show notes and links. So read the source material, and then I guess my patronizing accents might come into a better understanding. If you would like to follow the show on Twitter, do so at Cookbook West, and pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, and wherever fine podcasts can be found, mixed in with all the rest of us. Yeah, we're down in the W's. Yeah, that's right. You have to scroll down pretty far. It might take you a while. Just put in W West Coast. See what comes up. All right, all of that kidding has got to be put aside because I have some, I guess it's good news. I posted yesterday about my sister, who is a nurse, who is running the respiratory department at the major hospital in Josephine County here in Southern Oregon. We live in Jackson, but right on the county line. Now, she is a hard worker, completely dedicated, and is busy all the time with her grandkids, her husband, who's had some brain surgery and needs some, he's getting around. He can drive, but, he still needs some help. Shopping for my mom. I don't know why, but I understand, one person out there doing all this stuff is better than 10. But she really stretches herself thin out of duty, obligation, and heart. But Saturday, she came by to drop off some supplies and had mentioned that she was kind of feeling run down. And, of course, I said, well, it's no wonder. Maybe you ought to take a little rest. No, they need me at the hospital. All right. So yesterday, she coughed up blood, got tested early in the morning, and it did turn out that she's negative for coronavirus. Thank God. But she has some sort of bug and it's probably because she's worn down. But they did tell her to go home, kind of quarantine yourself, which she will do, and until she gets well. And they made it very clear that she cannot come back to work, even teleconferencing. They want her to take a rest. And it's bad for her because she knows there's so much work that needs to be done, but she also knows she can't just go there even with a mask. So she's got some sort of bug. I think, like I said, I think it's mostly from just being way worn down, and she might have a touch of the regular flu. I mean, that can still be devastating. Oh, she's 64. She should be retired. Well, she is retired. She put in 25 years at CHOCS, that's Children's Hospital of Orange County, in what? Pediatric oncology. Nursing in that for 25 years, and her idea of retirement was to come and run the respiratory department at the major hospital here in Southern Oregon that was, before she came, woefully behind the times. So good news, and thank you to those of you out there who reached out and extended goodwill and heartfelt concern. It is heartfelt here on our end as well. Thank you. All right, we better dive into this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. It's Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays, and it does come out of SCOTUS blog by Amy Howe. Okay, and Van Buren v. United States. The justices agreed to decide whether it is a federal crime for someone with permission to access information on a computer to access that information for an improper purpose. Now, I got to tell you, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Of course, it could have broad implications, because Aaron Swartz was hounded to death for what was called an improper use of a computer. Well, actually, they called it an improper use of a publicly accessible information news site. But I don't know. They decided that it was bad. Well, in this situation, it's really odd, and I can see why the lower courts said, no, you can't just have permission and then start using that database for illegal or improper purposes. So, let's see. The question comes to the court in a petition filed by Nathan Van Buren, a Georgia police officer who became the subject of an FBI sting operation after he asked a man named Andrew Albo, who had previously accused prostitutes of stealing money from him, for a loan. At the FBI's instruction, Albo asked Van Buren to run a computer search for a license plate number that supposedly belonged to a local exotic dancer. According to the story concocted by the FBI, Albo liked the dancer but wanted to make sure that she wasn't an undercover police officer. Van Buren agreed to do the search for Albo, and then Albo gave him $6,000 in total. The Georgia police officer said, "It was just a trifle. The guy asked me a question about something. He wanted to know if she was an undercover cop, and you're going to divulge that to a potential perp? And you're a cop yourself? That right there would get the guy fired." You would think. And I guess you could also say, oh, it was entrapment. Was it? Van Buren was charged with violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which makes it a federal crime to either access a computer without authorization or to exceed that user's authorized access and obtain information. Van Buren was convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit upheld Van Buren's conviction, rejecting his argument that he could not have violated the CFAA because he had permission to access the databases. Citing a division among the courts of appeal on the question presented by his case, Van Buren then went to the Supreme Court. He argued that if the lower court is correct, then any trivial breach of the conditions imposed by, for example, employers or the terms of service for a website, from checking sports scores at work to inflating one's height on a dating website, would be a federal crime. The Roberts Court agreed to weigh in. Chung of Reuters brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. The U.S. Supreme Court handed BP unit Atlantic Richfield a victory on Monday yesterday, making it harder for Montana landowners to seek a more extensive cleanup of a hazardous waste site than the federal government had ordered. In a case involving the EPA Superfund program, responsible for cleaning up certain toxic waste sites, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out a state court's decision that allowed the claims for restoration damages by the private landowners at Atlantic Richfield's former Anaconda copper smelter in western Montana to proceed to trial. In a 7-2 ruling authored by conservative Chief Justice John Balls and Strikes Roberts, we never call a foul on the home team, Roberts, the court decided that under the law governing Superfund sites, the property owners needed the EPA's approval before undertaking restorations of their own contaminated land. Wow, it sounds like a taking to me. Are they being recompensated at true market value? That system ensures the, quote, careful development of a single EPA-led cleanup effort rather than tens of thousands of competing individual ones, Roberts wrote. Wow. Jeez. Now listen to this. In a dissent, Neil Gorsuch, joined by fellow conservative Clarence Thomas, denounced the implication that property owners cannot be trusted to clean up their lands without causing trouble. Now, the case hinged on the scope of the Superfund law. The Superfund program, started in 1980, is intended to identify contaminated sites and ensure that those responsible for the pollution pay for the hazardous waste cleanup. It has been criticized over the years for slow cleanup efforts. Well, you would think, since it was instituted in 1980. The decision represented a victory for companies like Atlantic Richfield and business groups that said the lower court's decision could have led to thousands more lawsuits against companies nationwide, further complicating federally mandated improvements to contaminated land. The Anaconda smelter operated between 1884 and 1980 near the small community of Opportunity, Montana. Looks like they lost a lot of opportunity there, providing much of the world's copper supply. The area is filled with creeks and streams across forests and farmlands. It was designated as a Superfund site in 1983 to reduce arsenic contamination in residential yards, pastures, and groundwater. The landowners sued in 2008 in state court to restore their properties to pre-smelter conditions. Atlantic Richfield said such state law claims were barred by the EPA's actions under the Superfund law. Trump's administration and industry lobby groups backed Atlantic Richfield, which has spent $450 million on EPA-ordered soil and groundwater restoration at the site. Yesterday's ruling included a sharp exchange between Roberts and Gorsuch. Roberts sought to allay landowner concerns because the law does not apply to minor actions such as planting a garden, installing a lawn sprinkler, or digging a sandbox. That is fine, Gorsuch replied, provided, of course, they don't scoop out too much arsenic in the process. Gorsuch said the court should have allowed restoration efforts under state law and compared requiring EPA approval to paternalistic central planning. Roberts said it was instead the spirit of cooperative federalism. Sounds like feudalism to me. Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is by Shane Dixon Kavanaugh of the Oregonian. Oregon's decades-long practice of allowing split verdicts to convict felony defendants came to an end yesterday, Monday, when the U.S. Supreme Court found such jury systems to be unconstitutional in a ruling that could invalidate hundreds of criminal convictions in the state. The 6-3 vote overturns an earlier decision by the nation's high court nearly 50 years ago that allowed two states, Oregon and Louisiana, with all those chain gangs, to continue the practice which critics say had its roots in racial, ethnic, and religious bigotry. The case centered on a Louisiana man, Evangelisto Ramos, who was convicted by a 10-2 jury in 2016 of killing a woman in New Orleans. Louisiana later amended its constitution to prohibit split jury convictions, but only in cases prosecuted after 2018. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote in the majority opinion for Ramos v. Louisiana that non-unanimous juries are inconsistent with the constitutional right to a jury trial. 5 justices from across the court's ideological spectrum, Clarence Thomas, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Brett Kavanaugh joined the ruling, which also said the split jury laws were based in discrimination. Courts in both Louisiana and Oregon have frankly acknowledged that race was a motivating factor in adoption of their states' respective non-unanimity rules, wrote Gorsuch. In a dissent, Alito warned that the decision could trigger, quote, a potential tsunami of litigation on the jury unanimous issue. At a minimum, all defendants whose cases are still on direct appeal will presumably be entitled to a new trial if they were convicted by less than unanimous verdict, and preserve the issue in the trial court. And at least in Oregon, even if no objection was voiced at trial, defendants may be able to challenge their convictions based on plain error. Wow. And that's a bad thing? John Roberts and Justice Elena Kagan also dissented from the majority opinion. Well, we better get to our break, and it will probably be a short one because look at the time. And when we get back from that very short break, we will go through weather from around the world and finish up with the stories that we have curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Steve Mirsky. In keeping with the net increase in entropy of the universe, this is the 3,000th episode of 60-Second Science. So we'll take a break today from our usual coverage for some brief comic relief. Because everybody loves a blooper reel, here are some highlights from the last 13 and a half years of this podcast.
See, when an animal makes a toxin...
You've probably heard that the world's honeybees have suffered stinging losses lately. That's a big story for us, too. Up to $12 billion in crops rely on the fuzzy flyers for pollination. Of the 2.4 billion jillion zillion honeybee colonies in the U.S., about 1 million died off this past winter. You've probably heard that the world's honeybees have suffered stinging losses lately. That's a big story for us, too. Up to $12 billion in crap.
Phosphatidylserine, a death knell. You, me, and John Donne. You, me, and John Donne. You, me, and John Donne will probably pick the... Shut the f*** up.
So we'll take a brief bleh.
If you'd enjoy a free preview issue of Scientific American, as well as a lovely new gift... you know what? It just says, plus a gift. It's like, I'm giving you a free preview issue... as well as a gift. What's the damn free preview issue? It's a gift.
Instead, scientists have found that these caterpillars upchuck a fluid that's chock full of surfactants, chemicals that make liquids bleh.
The teddy bear somehow wound up in a fish and game department trout hatchery pool. Once in the pool, it clogged a drain, and the increasingly stagnant water became depleted of oxygen. Hatchery supervisor Robert Fawcett...
The researchers smeared
Okay, well, thanks very much, John.
Thanks. On behalf of myself and all the boys, I hope we pass the audition.
For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm John Rennie.
For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Karen Hopkin.
For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Steve Mirsky.
Hi, it's Tom. Could we humbly suggest your donation to netrootsradio.com? All we've got to run this 24-hour powerhouse of progressive resistance radio is what comes out of our own wallets. And you are our biggest donor. It doesn't take much, $3, $5. Just go to the bottom of our netrootsradio.com page and hit our secure donate button. Heck, you can even make a recurring contribution, and you'll get a wondiferous pair of Netroots radio stickers for application to your backpack, your bumper sticker, or your banjo. Well, it's up to you which backpack you want to put it on. So donate what you'd like at the bottom of our netrootsradio.com's homepage, because you are our biggest donor. netrootsradio.com. Together, we are Resistance Radio.
What does the coronavirus teach us about our election system? I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. On Tuesday, March 17th, Arizona, Florida, and Illinois held their primaries as planned, but Ohio postponed its primary, as have other states, including Georgia, Maryland, and Louisiana, and for good and not pretextual reasons. The coronavirus could put at risk voters and poll workers, and fear of being infected by the virus could keep many voters away from the polls altogether. But actually going to the polls should not be a prerequisite for voting. Some states allow voting by mail. Absentee ballots traditionally required a good reason why the voter couldn't vote on Election Day, but some states are now allowing no excuse necessary absentee ballots. And some states allow early voting, which increases turnout and would reduce the possibility of infection and fear of being infected. The failure to disallow early voting, no excuse absentee voting, and voting by mail, as a practical matter, these function as a method of voter suppression. Of course, none of these methods for allowing people to vote is required, even though these methods enhance voter participation and democratic principles and the constitutional principle of one person, one vote. Nonetheless, not having these methods of voting still conforms to the laws of the states where the voting occurs, and those laws will remain in effect unless and until they are changed. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1920. That was the day remembered in Butte, Montana as Bloody Wednesday, or the Anaconda Road Massacre. Butte was in the heart of copper mining country. By the turn of the century, Butte's population was 25% Irish. The Copper King of Montana was a man named Marcus Daly. He sat at the head of the Anaconda Mining Company. Workers simply called it the Company. Hailing himself from Ireland, the County Cavan, the Copper King was known to prefer Irish workers. With the spread of electricity, copper wiring was in high demand. Then World War I grew demand even further, and the company was in the business of delivering that copper with little regard for workers' safety. This disregard resulted in tragedy. A fire in June of 1917 killed 168 workers at the Granite Copper Mine. Miners went out on strike demanding better safety. The company called in federal troops to return the workers to the mines. The industrial workers of the world arrived in Butte to help organize the miners. Unionization efforts were met with armed resistance from the company. Frank Little, an IWW organizer, was hanged from a railroad trestle. No one was held accountable. Finally, on April 19th, the workers had had enough. They went out on strike. 2 days later, hundreds of miners gathered in front of the Neversweet mine on Anaconda Road. They were met by Pinkerton detectives hired by the company. The company gun thugs fired into the crowd of workers, shooting many in the back as they tried to flee. 16 workers were wounded and 1 man died. The strike collapsed a few weeks later. Today's Labor History in 2 brought to you in memory of Carol Hillman, a passionate friend of workers and volunteer of the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River in the Rogue River Valley of southern Oregon on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 49 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting a high of nearly the same as yesterday, about 72 to 74 degrees. Overnight lows will be in the upper 40s to low 50s. Sunshine and clouds mixed today. It looks like we're mostly sunny at the moment. Winds will be out of the west-northwest in a couple of hours at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Partly cloudy this evening, followed by increasing clouds with showers developing after midnight with a low of around 50. Winds out of the north-northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Looking to possibly bring about a quarter of an inch tonight through tomorrow, with rain early, then remaining cloudy with showers in the afternoon with a high of only around 65. Oh, heaven forbid. Winds will be out of the southwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour tomorrow. Confirmed cases of coronavirus here in Jackson County is standing at 49 with no deceased. And so that's good, I guess. Grass pollen locally is rated high. The regional air quality index is good at 28 parts per million. And the daytime UV index has spiked again into a high rating of 7. So everybody take care if you see that number in your abode. Barometric pressure is rising at 30.26 inches. Visibility is at 8 miles. And relative humidity is at 88%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by people's personal weather stations that they purchased. These people planted these purchased personal weather stations somewhere on their property. And these people positively live around the world. Okay. As you know, some people have their P-tapes, which they had to steal. No pun intended. And I have mine. London is 64 degrees and sunny, and it looks like Boris didn't listen to anybody ever. Paris is 68 and sunny with coronavirus restrictions in place. Rome is 63 and mostly cloudy with lots of coronavirus spiking again, unfortunately. Kyiv is 51 and mostly cloudy with a spike in coronavirus. Kabul is 61 and fair. Actually, their coronavirus is flattening at the moment for infections. Hong Kong is 75 and partly cloudy, and they will have another spike of coronavirus because they just won't, practice social distancing. They won't. Tokyo is 57 and mostly cloudy with a threat of even more restrictions because of coronavirus. Sydney, Australia is 62 and clear, and they still have coronavirus. And they've shut down their schools, and it looks like their restrictions are going to become even more strict. San Francisco, California is 52 and partly cloudy with the statewide stay-in-place order still in place. And New York is 58 degrees Fahrenheit, mostly cloudy, with the most coronavirus deaths in the nation. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by people's personal weather stations that they purchased. These people planted these purchased personal weather stations somewhere on their property, and these people positively live around the world. Anonymous worker bees at Reuters bring us this first amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. The World Health Organization said today that all available evidence suggests the novel coronavirus originated in animals in China late last year and was not manipulated or produced in a laboratory. Donald Trump said last week that his government was trying to determine whether the virus emanated from a lab in the central Chinese city of Wuhan, where the coronavirus pandemic emerged in December, and yet it was already showing up in the Austrian Alps, the Austrian-Italian Alps in November. All available evidence suggests the virus has an animal origin is not manipulated or constructed in a lab or somewhere else, whose spokeswoman, Fadela Shaib, told a Geneva news briefing it is likely that the virus is of animal origin, which basically says they still don't know. It was not clear, Chabe added, how the virus had jumped the species barrier to humans, but there has certainly been an intermediate animal host. In other words, we don't eat bats, but there are other animals that do. It most likely has its ecological reservoir in bats, but how the virus came from bats to humans is still to be seen and discovered. She did not respond to a request to elaborate on whether it was possible the virus may have been inadvertently escaped from a lab. The Wuhan Institute of Virology has dismissed rumors both that it synthesized the virus or allowed it to escape. Chabe asked about the impact of Trump's decision last week to suspend funding to the agency over its handling of the pandemic, said, "We are still assessing the situation about the announcement by President Trump." We don't use the P word here at Netroots Radio because our style manual generally forbids it, but this is a direct quote from a UN representative. And she went on and said, "We will assess the situation and we will work with our partners to fill any gaps."
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière. La promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Ever more anonymous worker bees at Reuters bring us this final amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Millions of children in the Middle East will become poor as their caregivers lose jobs from lockdowns aimed at stemming the spread of coronavirus across the region, according to UNICEF. UNICEF said children were nearly half of an estimated 8 million people who will be hurt by the loss of about 1.7 million jobs this year as a result of businesses closing, salaries being suspended, and other effects of lockdowns in the region. I'm a little confused by the term caregiver. You mean parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles? Interesting how that was determined by an editor somewhere. It is evident that the pandemic is affecting children firsthand. Many families in the region are already becoming poorer due to the loss of jobs, especially to the daily paid. Families are struggling to bring food to their table due to containment measures, and about 110 million children are now at home and not in schools in the region, UNICEF said. Humanitarian agencies and NGOs say curfews and lockdowns are already making it difficult or impossible for many to provide for their families. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you know that Netroots Radio will broadcast on, and we will meet up tomorrow for Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks. And we'll meet up here tomorrow, right here, in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théâtres, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Robe à fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.